And so, how do these three relate to each other? So, a relationship between the systems. So, again, from the id, the impulsive id, comes these drives, and then the ego is the real one that deals with the realistic. And then you have this super ego that kind of puts on a moral brake, or keeps it in check, keeps the ego in check, so that you still are in line with the morals or the standards that you want to live by. And that's how these three deal with it. So in therapy, psychoanalysis, which was created by Freud, has the primary goal of strengthening the I, right? So strengthening the I to make it independent of the overly strict superego or above I, and to increase its capacity to become aware of and control the repressed or hidden it or id. That's the idea there. Okay, if we look at the study guide, we realize that we are going to skip the the psychosexual development that Freud had talked about. Again, this also has influenced a lot of people, but we do not believe there is too much evidence to support many of these things. Some of them do have some evidence, but that will be for another time. Okay, so moving on to the next stage and talking about dealing with anxiety. So the what Freud had said, the major problem for individuals, for the personality, is how to deal with anxiety. Now, anxiety is triggered by expected or foreseen, is triggered by an expected or foreseen increase in tension or displeasure, right? So you expect that you're going to have this tension or displeasure, and it can develop in any situation. And the key point here is that it's real or imagined, when the threat to some part of the body or your psyche is too great to be ignored or mastered. So what is it saying again? The major problem of the psyche is to deal with anxiety, and anxiety is triggered when we expect that we're going to experience tension or displeasure from a real or an imagined event. And so he gives some of these examples, including loss of a desired object. So losing, for a little kid, losing their toy. For an adult, losing their equivalent of a toy, crashing your car. Losing a romantic partner, right? Losing a romantic partner in your life. A loss of an identity. So what happens if you're starting on your career and you get fired? What happens if you get laid off of your job that you've been working on for 40 years? In a lot of ways in our society, when we meet someone, we say, hey, what's your name? How you doing? What do you do? So their work is a major source of their identity, and what happens when you lose it? Or the loss of love for self, and any act that might cause self-hate. So you do something that you regret, right? You have an affair, you get drunk and do something stupid, examples like that. And so Freud said that there's three types of these anxiety, right? And he said the objective one is a real event, right? A literal, fear of your life. So running away from a bear that's chasing you down. That's objective. And then the neurotic anxiety is due between a clash between the id and the ego. Remember, the I and the above I. So a woman fears that her sexual attraction toward a male coworker will overcome her conscious control not to do anything, right? So a man or a woman wanting to sleep with their boss or with their employee, and it's not allowed, so that would be an example of that. So and then finally, in moral anxiety, the ego and the superego conflict. So let's look at that again. Neurotic is felt between the id, so this strong desire and I, and then in the moral anxiety, it's between the I and the above I, or the ego and the superego. A student demands that all his assignments are perfectly error-free, a standard the ego cannot meet. So there's some people out there that are perfectionists, right? And this would be an example. They want everything to be perfect, everything on time, everything to go as they planned, and it's just not realistic. Remember, the ego is the one that has to deal with reality, and the superego is the one that has these perfect ideals for you. And you say, I'm going to get an A in every single class. Well, that's the superego talking. the ego is saying, there's a problem here. And so those are the examples. Those are the three examples of those three. And so how do we deal with them? Well, Freud had kind of started this process of saying that we use what's called defensive mechanisms to deal with that anxiety, whether it's the objective, the real fear, or the neurotic, which is the psychological fear, or the moral fear. He develops it, and his daughter Anna Freud was the one that really carried on the defensive mechanisms and really outlined them and put them out for us. And so the ones I put down for you in the study guide deal, these ones right here, there is some form of scientific evidence to support each of these, right? And so these are the ones that I wanted you to look at. Other ones have also been added, and I don't know what the research is on those. But let's look at what these ones are. Repression. Repression forces a potentially anxiety-provoking event, idea, or perception away from the consciousness, thus precluding any possible resolution. So the problem is you can't come to a resolution if you put this thing that's been bothering you to the back of your mind. And if we all truly think about it, there's probably something in our life that causes us a little anxiety, and we've kind of been pushing it off. A bill we needed to pay, a debt we needed to pay someone back, an apology we had to do someone. So the idea is that this repression, what it does is we take energy to push this thought or this anxiety provoking feeling away to the back of our mind. But they're saying the problem with doing this is that you never address the issue, one. And two, it requires a lot of energy to keep putting it back there. And the reality is that it's still affecting you. And I'll give you an example. For the longest time, I had this bill I had to settle that I was worried about. It was a large amount of money at the time, and I was concerned about it, and I kept avoiding it. But yet, it would always cause me an anxiety every time I thought about it. And then one day, I just called and said, I need help, making this payment, and they lowered it significantly, and I was able to pay it off right away. And it's so funny because I carried that anxiety for years, when in reality, it took a 10-minute phone call, and I was done with it. So pretty interesting, right? So Freud in his psychoanalysis, or sitting down, he's the one that kind of invented this idea of when you have problems, you go to a therapist, and the therapist sits and talks to you and mainly listens to you and tries to find out, what's happening in your world, right? Freud is the one that pretty much invented this. It's changed in a lot of ways, but in many ways it's still the same. So that's repression. The next one, denial. The unwillingness to accept an event that disturbs the ego. So repression isn't putting it to the back of the mind. It's completely denying it. Right? It reminds me of that old song that it's a silly song, but he says, the guy's talking about cheating and doing this, and he says it wasn't me, and I got arrested and it wasn't me. So this isn't about putting something in the back of the mind and avoiding it. This is actually clearly denying it. Right? And so there's a quote down here by Nietzsche, and he says, I have done that, says my memory. And then it says, it is impossible that I should have done it, says my pride, and it remains inexorable. Finally, my memory yields. So in other words, the memory that said that you did this, and my pride said, no, I didn't. And in the end, which one wins? The pride, right? The pride wins. To the point where you can truly believe that you did or didn't do something because of your pride, when in reality it did happen. That if you keep telling yourself over and over and over and over you didn't do something, that in the end you may even believe it. Whereas someone who's sitting on the outside objectively is like, man, I cannot even believe you, that you're lying to yourself, that you've denied it. And so that's denial. The next one, rationalization, is a process of finding, keyword here, acceptable reasons for unacceptable thoughts or actions. A person presents an explanation that is either ethically acceptable to others or logically consistent with attitude. So in other words, you're using logic, and you're using acceptable reasons to explain unacceptable actions. So when someone says, I'm doing this for your own good, right? So they're rationalizing, and maybe what they're really saying is, I want to do this to you, I don't want it done to me, and I even want you to suffer a little bit, right? I even want you to suffer a little bit. So rationalization is a way of accepting pressure from the superego. It disguises our motives, rendering our actions morally acceptable, right? And so I like this part here. It goes on, and I didn't read the whole thing, but the idea is clear. I have chosen, said the mouse, to like cheese. Such an important decision, needless to say, cannot be arrived at with sufficient period of careful deliberation. One does not deny the immediate, indefinable aesthetic attraction of the substance, yet this in itself is possible only to the more refined type of individual. As an example, the brutish fox lacks the sensitive discrimination even to approach cheese, right? So this mouse is saying, he's decided he likes cheese, but the fox doesn't like it because he doesn't have his palate on his tongue isn't fine enough, right? So the idea here is, the mouse it doesn't want to admit that, it's biologically there's a drive for him to like cheese. He says, no, it's because I'm refined. Right? And that's a more acceptable way to be. And there we go right there. Reaction formation is pretty interesting. It substitutes behaviors or feelings diametrically opposed to the actual wish. It's an explicit and usually unconscious inversion of the wish. There's this there is this important theorist that I listen to, Anthony DeMello, and in one of his talks, he's a priest, and he says, I don't know if it's a joke or a saying or what, and he says, the prostitute is always talking about God, and the priest is always talking about sex. And it's funny and ironic, right? Because the priest has decided to give up sex, right? And so reaction formation says that he gave up his wish of sex, and so that he went totally against it. And then the prostitute, who, is doing an act that according to many religions or her God is unacceptable, right? And so she said that, she's always talking about God, but yet she decides to live this life that presumably is ungodworthy, right? And that would be the idea of reaction formation, is that you end up doing the exact opposite. Another idea might be dealing with sexuality for someone who might be homosexual, and maybe they live in a society or a culture that it doesn't accept it, and so instead of accepting their wish or who they are, they end up deciding to be over masculine, right? They end up being real tough, like as manly as they can. And I can think of Bruce Jenner, who, the idea is Caitlyn Jenner, right? So the idea is that, lived his life but always felt like a female. And yet, what happened? As Bruce Jenner, he became a male Olympian, right? And if we, in our culture, we might say that's very male, to go to the ultimate of what it means to be a male. And yet we know now later is this whole time may have felt like a woman the whole time. So that's reaction formation. Projection. Projection, the act of attributing to another person, animal, or object the qualities, feelings, or intentions that originate in oneself is called projection. Now, think about this. Remember that story I told you in the beginning, and I said that I was ashamed of myself for being a bully, and what my mind had done quickly was to project onto this other person I hadn't thought about in years, and to say they were such a bully and a jerk. And it was only at that point where I realized, like, whoa, how did I get here? And went back, that I realized that the real fear or anxiety was myself. That, hey, maybe I'm not who I thought I was. Maybe I can be a bully, right? That's a reality of human nature that you're going to find hopefully in this class, is that we tend as individuals to want to believe that we are good people who do good things and that are consistent in our behavior. And when we truly believe this, that we're all these things, it leads us to sometimes being very bad people, because then we project, we lie, we rationalize, we hide from the truth, we blame people, all because we don't want to see ourselves as bad. And as a matter of fact, when we look at evil from a psychological point of view, you're going to realize that there is no Dr. Evil out there trying to hurt people, but rather people who think they're good and who do bad things the whole time thinking they're doing something right. But they've rationalized, justified, blamed, and done other things to make themselves look good. And that's why I really wanted you guys to explore these defensive mechanisms. And there we go. That's projection. And then the last one that we will discuss in this lecture is regression. It's a reversion to an early level of development, to a simpler and more childlike mode of expression. It's a way of alleviating anxiety by withdrawing from realistic thinking into behaviors that have reduced anxiety in the past. So he says Linus in the Penis comic strip always returns to a safe psychological situation when he is under stress. He feels secure when he is holding his blanket. A person who's regressing may prefer the ice cream flavor he or she was given as a child, or may reread a favorite book as a way to withdraw from the present. So the idea is that we go back to these forms of safety, these very, we grew up in something gave us safety when we were young. It might have been our parents, a song, and that when things are really going bad, we want to just crawl into a ball and go back to these old things. And that's the idea. The rest of them, defensive mechanisms, are very interesting as well. The sublimination for me is one of the only ones that it says that you actually take that energy and instead of doing something bad or denying or repressing or blaming or rationalizing, that you actually turn it into creative energy. So I think you might find that interesting as well. Okay, so going back to our study guide, and we're at the very end. The theory of psychoanalysis, we've already kind of talked about it, and why you'll bring them up, but I'm going to leave that to you guys and I'll show you where it is. So here's psychoanalysis, the theory. And again, he felt like the main idea was that people fall into these neurotic ways, or this anxiety is driving them, and if they could just come back more to their ego and realize, like, hey, what is really going on? Why am I repressing or denying, or what's scaring me so much? That you can cure the individual. For me, what was really interesting was, if you go to the end of the chapter, you're going to find this. Here's that part on research. So I want you to be able to read, this case study method, the unconscious and defensive mechanisms. And you can look over briefly the effectiveness of psychoanalysis. But really at the very end, I thought this was very interesting when they say the theory firsthand and excerpt from Studies in Hysteria. And I would suggest, because this is Freud at his finest, this is a story that he writes about, and it gives a good idea of what is happening in the unconscious. That is it for now, guys. I hope you enjoy this video lecture. If you like it and you think it helps, or if you have suggestions on how it can be better, please go ahead and shoot me an email. Till next time, I am Professor Fernandez. We'll see you later.